20 snowy mountains, the only moving thing was the eye of the blackbird. 2. I was of 3 minds, like a tree in which there are 3 blackbirds. 3. The blackbird whirled in the autumn winds. It was a small part of the pantomime. 4. A man and a woman are one. A man and a woman and a blackbird are one. 5. I do not know which to prefer, the beauty of inflections or the beauty of innuendos, the blackbird whistling or just after. 6. Icicles filled the long window with barbaric glass. The shadow of the blackbird crossed it to and fro. The mood traced in the shadow an indecipherable cause. 7. O thin men of Haddam, why do you imagine golden birds? Do you not see how the blackbird walks around the feet of the women about you? 8. I know noble accents and lucid, inescapable rhymes, but I know too that the blackbird is involved in what I know. 9. When the blackbird flew out of sight, it marked the edge of one of many circles. 10. At the sight of the blackbirds flying in a green light, even the bawds of euphony would cry out sharply. 11. He rode over Connecticut in a glass coach. Once a fear pierced him. In that he mistook the shadow of his equipage for blackbirds. 12. The river is moving. The blackbird must be flying. 13. It was evening all afternoon. It was snowing, and it was going to snow. The blackbird sat in the cedar limbs.
I noticed something that I hadn't noticed before, and that he changes a word.
Yeah.
He says rhymes instead of rhythms in section 8, sorry. And lucid, inescapable rhythms, it says in my book. Well, any first thoughts?
You put me on?
Yeah.
Lloyd.
Yes.
I find it curious that the numbering the verses is actually part of the reading of the poem. That's an intrinsic part of the poem.
I was surprised by that on the recording as well. But I guess since there's a number in the title, that the numbering was important to him. But I never heard it that way in my head.
I appreciate the numbering because it emphasizes the discrete quality of each of the sections. And it gives me a way to take a very sort of pounded and grounded break between each image.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense.
He has a fabulous voice.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it's an amazing voice.
I also found that by saying 3 in lunch, das from the image of the three blackbirds into that sudden whirling motion of the blackbird, which for me is such a striking movement at the very beginning, from the static images to the motion, and the number three being repeated emphasize the three before, the three blackbirds before.
Right. Right. Yeah. Yeah. That right. I'm gonna be a little what's the word? I have some problem with the way he reads this poem. And I love the way he reads other poems. And I think this does tell us something about the way he hears the poem. But there's a kind of, well, I don't know. I am of two minds, or should I say of three minds.
Well, Lloyd, would you mind reading the poem in a way that you hear it? Because
okay, I'll read it the way I hear it. I guess I'll read the numbers.
Well, if you don't hear them that way, don't read them that way.
Well, now I do.
Okay.
13 ways of looking at a blackbird. 1. Among 20 snowy mountains, the only moving thing was the eye of a blackbird. Sorry, I'm going to do it again.
Yeah.
13 ways of looking at a blackbird. 1. Among 20 snowy mountains, the only moving thing was the eye of the blackbird. 2. I was of three minds, like a tree in which there are three blackbirds. 3. The blackbird whirled in the autumn winds. It was a small part of the pantomime. 4. A man and a woman are one. A man and a woman and a blackbird are one. 5. I do not know which to prefer, the beauty of inflections or the beauty of innuendos, the blackbird whistling or just after. 6. Icicles filled the long window with barbaric glass. The shadow of the blackbird crossed it, to and fro. The mood traced in the shadow an indecipherable cause. 7. O thin men of Haddam, why do you imagine golden birds? Do you not see how the blackbird walks around the feet of the women about you? 8. I know noble accents and lucid, inescapable rhythms, but I know too that the blackbird is involved in what I know. 9. When the blackbird flew out of sight, it marked the edge of one of many circles. 10. At the sight of blackbirds flying in a green light, even the bawds of euphony would cry out sharply. 11. He rode over Connecticut in a glass coach. Once a fear pierced him. Once a fear pierced him, in that he mistook the shadow of his equipage for blackbirds. 12. The river is moving. The blackbird must be flying. 13. It was evening all afternoon. It was snowing, and it was going to snow. The blackbird sat in the cedar limbs.
That's better.
I agree.
Pat?
Oh, I just said I agree. I like Lloyd's style.
Oh, Mary. I really love the way Wallace Stevens reads, and if you get a chance, listen to him reading his poem, "The Idea of Order at Key West." The poem, obviously, 13 Ways of Looking at a Blackbird, is a poem that's full of portent, but not just. And for me, fascinating as it is to hear Stevens read his own poem, everything sounds portentous. Everything sounds like it has the same the same weight, the same profound quality.
It was an early poem. You'd guess that he's reading it years, even decades later.
I think so. I don't know when that recording was made, but it has to be many years later. Of course, there was no even the recording techniques at the time he wrote the poem was 1917, something like that. It would be a very scratchy recording, and he would have a definitely a younger voice. So he is looking back many years to when he wrote that poem. What do you think of the poem? Jim, are you?
You?
No. Okay. All right. It looked like you were saying something interesting.
Yeah. I love the poem, but there's half of it I just don't understand. But I now know where Haddam is.
Right. Would you tell us?
Well, I'm told by my Google using wife that it's in Connecticut.
Right. It's near New Haven.
Yeah.
Which is where Stevens sold insurance.
Hartford.
Oh, near Hartford. I'm sorry. Yes.
And I guess you'll get to what the glass carriage is.
Perhaps.
I sent Lloyd there is not a setting of the poems, but the poems are just read, but then followed by musical interludes by somebody named Thomas Albert, called 13 Ways, and played by the 8th Blackbird musical ensemble, which I find fills the spaces that I don't understand in this poem.
Right.
Lloyd,
yes.
This is Mike Steffen, and
hi, Mike.
How are you? And it's a poem I love. I know people are they're having a hard time, and I have a hard time, but I remember hearing one unifying thing about the poem is that cubism was very much in the air, and one way of looking at the entirety of the poem is getting these multiple perspectives with one subject, which is the Blackbird. So if you look, for instance, at Picasso's The Weeping Woman, or many of Braque or Picasso's, you're getting all of these different angles at one subject in a sort of simultaneity. And that's one idea. I don't know where I picked that up, but that's one way to unify the purpose. What he was trying to do is get multiple perspectives of one subject.
Yeah, I think that's very helpful, extremely helpful, and it is 13 ways of looking at a blackbird. So it is every way is from a different angle, from a different poetic angle, from a different visual angle. Susan, your sense of the way that the change from the second stanza to the third, the kind of radical change from the second stanza to the third stanza, really goes along with this idea, this kind of cubist idea, this radical change of perspective from moment to moment, which is, I guess which is one of my reservations about the way Stevens reads, because he reads it all as if it's the same, as if every stanza has the same tone to it. Any other sort of just general thoughts about, or Denise? Hi.
Morning.
Good morning.
Interestingly, I've loved this poem for a long time, and I've never understood it really. But it also evokes a visual art experience for me, which is Hokusai's 36 Views of Mount Fuji.
Exactly.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, perfect. Yeah.
Lloyd, I was going to add that it was not one, but really two art theories that were tugging at him. One was Cubism, the other was Imagism. And I kind of feel as if Stevens is very self-consciously trying to be more than one thing at a time. And for me, not as satisfying. I don't think he's as satisfying an imagist, influenced by the Japanese and the Chinese, where they would present the thing as if the thing itself would radiate meaning. And I am always feeling him tinkering with meaning, so that unlike the imagist, I feel he's trying to be both, and he's being more successful at being a cubist than being an imagist. I feel he intellectualizes his images, and sometimes for me, not in all the stanzas, but sometimes that distances me and does not win me over. Some do, some don't.
Yeah, I would, yeah, I don't know about the, I mean, I actually love the imagist quality in Stevens, but I also think that, I think some of these stanzas are really better than other stanzas. Although I love the poem, I wouldn't have chosen it and maybe some of the 13 ways of looking at a blackbird are, some of the ways are better than other ways, and that's part of the variety of the poem.
Lloyd?
Yes,
It's
Jennifer.
Jennifer. I was just going to say, it's fun. It has been fun for me with my students, with a group of students, jumping from the points people have made about paintings A painter came to my class who'd done a series of 13 paintings responding to this poem, and he didn't show the paintings to the students. And the first question he asked them was, what sections have a blackbird in them? And number the sections and just say yes, no, whatever. And then we tallied that up and we didn't all agree. And that seemed to be a good question about what paintings have blackbirds in them or not, if it's 13 ways of looking. So I don't know. My students then got involved in a kind of game of it that led to some good questions. And I didn't have people worry about what it meant.
Right. Right. I mean, I think when you that meaning is always an issue in Wallace Stevens, that you can, that he is so tricky about some things that are just kind of teasing your mind, that when your impulse is to find meaning, it's often frustrated, or it's the teasing that's maybe more interesting than the meaning. Gail, were you gonna say something?
That was in another country, and besides, the wench is dead.
I don't know, Mark, do you have any sense of, do you want to say anything about meaning in Wallace Stevens, or in this poem in particular? No.
I think it feels like it's 13 ways of being a poet, and the poet is the blackbird, and how does the poet see the world? And the poet sees the crystal carriage and its death, and there's fear there, but the poet deals with death, and the poet is there when there's a man and a woman, and the poet is one. But it's how the poet experiences the world. If the river is flowing, there must be poetry in the air.
And to support what you said, the beauty of innuendo, Lloyd.
Yes, that's one of my favorite moments in the entire poem.
Well, innuendo is a very odd word to impose on this poem, which is mostly plain English. You know, innuendo, and the other word is
inflections.
Innuendos, inflections, but there was another one too later on. Equipage.
Yeah, equipage.
French.
Or equipage.
Equipage, yeah. Well, I guess that's right. But you know, that the elusiveness of the never really coming out with a very clear definition of what things are about seems to be his power, or the thing that intrigues people. I find the whole poem very obscure and strange, and I don't understand any of it.
Any of it?
Any of it, no. And it was so, I see Susan reading the poem and breaking into tears. And I look at her and I say, what? And she kind of explains a little of what it is, but it's beyond really. And
Mark Halliday? Any thought? You're muted. Can you unmute?
Well, what do you need to know about a poet? A poetic image, like icicles filled the long window with barbaric glass.
I'm sorry, say again?
there's an image here like icicles filled the long window with barbaric glass. Does it need to be anything more than just that?
Yeah. This time I was asking Mark Halliday.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Well, I mean, I would say to Mark Howland that it does actually need to be more than just a beautiful, sharp image, though Stevens knew that we love beautiful, sharp images, and that kind of enlivens our relation to reality. But, the problem with him is that he's more than 50% a poet of ideas. And he kind of knows that, but I think he's also terrified of turning out to be only a poet of ideas, because he knows he doesn't want to be a philosopher. So he's terrified of being too translatable or too paraphrasable. At the same time, he does sort of secretly want there to be meaning that can be figured out from every passage in his poetry. But, there's that line that we always remember in another poem. The poem must resist the intelligence almost successfully. And the key word is almost. He doesn't want to permanently resist intelligence, but he wants it to be difficult and tricky because that makes life exciting. So, I think we're right to try to figure out the meaning of each bit, but he would hate it if it was too easy for us.
Right. Well, I for me, he succeeds in both capacities. That my impulse is to read poems for meaning, and my impulse is to read Wallace Stevens for meaning, and that the parts that I don't get, that I don't quite understand, or I can't, or I kind of get but I can't articulate, are always very challenging to me. I mean, I really do want to kind of figure out what is going on in terms of meaning.
One thing this poem allows for me is kind of a multiplicity of associations, and they're eccentric and personal to me. The beauty of innuendo actually had me thinking about Caravaggio, whose painting is often at the moment between an event and the not happening. And just oddball ways that it have, I'm sure, nothing to do with his intention, but creates a kind of apparatus for just going in nutty ways.
Can anyone want to say anyone want to say anything about the difference between inflection and innuendo?
I think it's easier.
Oh.
It's easier, isn't it, to take the instances that follow, the blackbird whistling or just after, right? We feel the difference between those things so clearly, and maybe that's what I'm. I have to say, I'm sitting out next to a snowy window where my attention is on the birds, whether it's on the birds or not. And if I hear them and then go look, maybe they're there, maybe they're not. I think the poem wants to put the blackbird in our mind, whether it's there or not, and have us feel about how we look for things or how we feel them after they're gone. That innuendo or inflection, the whistling or just after, it's like the end of the Keats poem we talked about so long ago, fled. The very word is like a dream, that the song goes and then it's still with you. So some of what he's doing that moves me most is putting me in that frame of mind where I feel like, wait, there was a blackbird here. There just was. And maybe there would be, but maybe that shadow was the hawk and all the little birds are gone. So I think it's the poem's trying to put me in the frame of mind that my yard is trying to put me in right now, especially when we don't go out much anymore.
Right. Mary, were you going to?
Oh, yeah, I've been thinking, first of all, I'm so happy to hear that so many people are so bewildered by the poem, because I've always had a sort of an uncertain relationship with the poem, too, a difficult relationship. But I was just thinking about picking up a little bit on what Jennifer was saying, that there's a sense of, at least for me, part of what the poem does is there's this interplay between almost a photographic or cinematic impulse that blends with the subjective mind, and it's wandering, it's in motion. Does that help? And so I thought it's kind of, well, if you think about the title makes no claim. It says 13 ways of looking. And I thought,
why 13?
Yeah, I don't know. It's a kind of important number, right? We do the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. We do, and then the 13 is the one that we don't have, right? I don't know, but I think of it as an invitation.
I was wondering, Lloyd, doesn't Stephen say somewhere, and I'm sorry to be so obscure, but in heaven there are 3 voices. Where was that from?
I don't remember.
Is that
I don't.
Supreme notes on a Supreme Fiction, perhaps?
Okay.
And you get the second part of this poem that says, "I was of 3 minds," and you almost get the 13 in that capital I and the 3 minds, like a tree in which there are 3 blackbirds.
Yeah. I think there have to be 13, and that 13 is I just think of 13 as the ominous number.
Sure.
Yeah.
And
it's not a love poem.
And it's an irreducible number.
Right.
And yes, someone wrote something in the chat about cutting some of the stanzas, and as I say, I don't love every single stanza, but I do think there have to be 13.
Lloyd,
yeah, hi Jim.
I have a question. I can't, and it's related to the 13 in some way. I don't understand the connection between each verse, each canto, whether they build on each other, do they relate to each other, or are they 13 separate ways of looking? That's part of what makes the poem very difficult for me to grapple with. I don't have that feeling of it's building towards something, and maybe I'm looking at it in the wrong way, but
yeah. Well, I think it's a very good question. And I think it has something to do with what Mike was saying earlier about the Cubist approach, that it to me, yeah, I think that's one of the mysteries of the poem, that when I get to the end of the poem, I feel like I've really been through something. I've been through a mind working through a poet working out images and ideas, and that I don't always. I think maybe that's one of the things about Stephen's reading the numbers, that they do make a separation between the stanzas, and that they're not exactly building on one another, but that they're kind of they're turning things around. They're, you know, looking at things from a different angle. I mean, you know, I think sometimes that the poem could, you know, wouldn't be as good a title, but the poem could, you know, it is a way of looking at a blackbird, one way of looking at a blackbird, and they're all the same way, except that they're each different. And that's part of the mystery of the poem, that when you know, as I say, when I get to the end of it, I feel like I feel like I've really been through some very interesting and complicated and actually moving experience. But you know, I mean, partly I picked this poem because I wanted you to help me understand it more, and it's already working. You're already making me think about things that I haven't figured out, and that I'm not entirely alone. Mike?
I was just going to say, so much fundamentally about poetry is really how to use language in a way that evades sense and brings joy. If you think, and I can't exactly think of, well, Theodore Roethke's line, "In a dark time, the eye begins to see," makes absolutely no logical sense, but it makes a deep spiritual sense.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we use language discursively on the news, explaining things in what we would call a centripetal way, a way that is seeking a center to meaning. But we also have this notion of centrifugal, and that is winding away from meaning and the tyranny of the fixed idea that turns the motion of creative thinking eventually into dogma. At one time when the Christian church was forming 2,000 years ago, these ideas were very vital. They were energizing. They made sense against the brutality of the Roman Empire. But 1,400 years later, they were very oppressive ideas, which is just sort of a way of illustrating how we have to keep winding and winding for new meaning. And not understanding a poem is part of the beauty and the intrigue and the love of something. I think when you understand something completely, that's when it goes flat and almost dead. I mean, so I think this non sequitur between the sections is beautiful, and some of these sections, like the last two, are just breathtaking in the purity of their image. And well, Eliot said it very famously. He said, we understand poetry long before we can articulate that understanding.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
So just
thank you. Let's look at the first stanza for a moment.
Lloyd, before we jump in, I
Oh.
think Catherine wanted to say something.
I'm sorry. Sure. Catherine.
Did he know William Carlos Williams?
Yes, they were friends.
Because it looking at this, it looks as though he's sort of looking at what William Carlos Williams, and I can do it in 13. You only do it in 3. And I wonder too whether he's playing with the idea of not writing a haiku. None of these come out to 17. But visually, you think, oh, that might be a haiku. And
Yeah.
so you count them up. It's not.
I agree. I mean, I think that these really are 13 kinds of haikus, even if they're not literally
Right.
haikus.
But I think he was making that point. I'll
Yeah.
show you haiku, you know?
Yeah.
And I think in the difference between inflections and innuendos, one is about sound and one is about meaning. Because you talk differently.
Yeah.
Opposed to innuendo is usually in your head.
But not always.
I mean, harder to do in your voice than inflection is.
Well, inflection is inescapable.
Yeah.
There's always inflection.
But he read it without.
But there's sometimes innuendo. But there's sometimes innuendo in the voice.
Do you think that the poem begins? The only moving thing was the blackbird, and at the end, he's settled.
And at the end, I'm sorry?
Settled.
Huh. Yeah.
Well,
so that
it could start again because the blackbird's now sitting in the tree where the only thing moving is.
But any thought about, I want to ask what you think is the most interesting word of the first stanza.
20.
Why?
Because it follows 13, and I'm trying to figure out what the relationship is between these two numbers.
Okay. It's not my favorite word.
You didn't ask that.
I'm sorry?
You didn't ask that.
No, you didn't ask that. You asked it.
Which are the most interesting?
What's the most interesting word? Yeah. Okay. That's what I think. Yeah. We're in this vast landscape of 20 mountains. And the only moving thing is it's not the blackbird, but it's the eye of the blackbird. And I don't know. I mean, that to me, that seems profound to me, but I'm not quite sure I could explain it. Bill.
But he's kind of, in a way, it's straightforward. He's talking about ways of looking. Virtually all of them are about either movement, shape, color. There are only 2 colors that aren't black or white, gold and green, which almost makes one think of Robert Frost. But there's a kind of explicitness that this is about perception, sensation, and also one of the more intelligent birds in creation.
Right. I think the green is really shocking. In this poem, everything is so black and white.
And the golden is kind of distressing.
And golden is, there's a sort of magic there. Green is just to me, seems really shocking.
Isn't the eye of the blackbird also I, the letter I?
Well, it's
the personal.
Right. It's the first person.
Yeah. Well, sure. It could be. I mean, if you were just hearing it, I mean, if you were watching that if you were listening to that Wallace Stevens, there's no video, there's just a picture of him. And if you were just listening to him read it, you couldn't be absolutely sure it was EYE or just the I, the ego. Delia?
I just looking at Roman numerals and thinking it's in the one called I.
Yeah. What about I was of three minds? What do you think of that? What do you make of that line, the first line of the second part?
Well, it's playing on I was of two minds.
Right.
But it's funny.
Yeah, it's funny.
Yeah, it's witty, and it is playing with that cliche, but it's also challenging that cliche. That isn't it? That you can be of many minds. Certainly more than two.
Is that also setting up the question whether he is a blackbird?
I was of three minds, like a tree in which there are three blackbirds. Although he's comparing he's comparing himself to the tree.
Well, he's containing three minds.
Right. I was of three minds.
The other cliche is me, myself, and I, if you want
to. Right, yes. Denise?
Yes, I just wanted to add that besides being a poem of meaning or of image, I find this to be very much a poem of atmosphere. And I've always felt it very much resonates in New England. It begins with snow and it ends with snow and it's got icicles in the middle. And it has, since I first read it, affected the way that I look at landscapes and I look at the weather, which is probably why I have the mental comparison with Hokusai's images.
Yeah.
Well, I'll say something if you want me to.
Yes, Susan.
I like sounds. I was attracted to the sounds. There's three, tree, there, three.
Yeah, that's terrific. 3 tree 3. Yeah.
And there also, which is an anagram of three.
Yeah. Oh, I like that. I've never quite heard that, but now I will. Yeah. Well, I loved what Susan said about the transition from stanza 2 to stanza 3. The small part of the pantomime. What do you make of that? Any, Denise?
It brings to my mind Yeats's use of the expression casual comedy in Easter 1916, just as a way of speaking about life in the world.
Life.
Yeah.
Yeah. That everything there's everything out there. You can't always hear it, but it's all going on out there.
It's also, I think, the pantomime, Lloyd, perhaps an image of the silence of the poem itself.
Oh, I think so too. Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. Yeah, we don't really get any sound until the fifth section, the innuendo, the inflections and the innuendos and the whistling. It's all very silent. It's all very quiet.
Until you reach the bawds of euphony who cry out.
Right.
I also thought of pantomime as just, resisting meaning. When we look at a pantomime, we think we're getting the meaning. We're not sure we're getting the meaning. I kind of see him looking out of his own eyes, trying to figure out, am I seeing the world? Am I getting the meaning? Am I not getting the meaning? And again, relating it back to, Pound and what he took from the Chinese would present the poem without that thought. They would just give you the world. In a sense, we would just see the pantomime. We had to create that. I said is playing a double game. He's creating it, then he's backing off from creating it. He's playing the ambivalent game that maybe modern minds have to play. Do we know what we're seeing? And do we know how to interpret what we're seeing?
Yeah. What about man and a woman are one? Man and a woman and a blackbird are one. Mark Halliday, you have a grin, an irresistible grin. Do you want to say anything?
Well, the poem seems to beg to be parodied or satirized in some way. I mean, I love it, but that passage immediately made me think: a man, a woman, a blackbird, and what about the jar of peanut butter?
In Tennessee.
Exactly. Yeah.
It kind of echoes I was of three minds in a way, right? That
right.
Three minds separates the mind, the single, into three, and the man and woman kind of bring them back. I don't know. I see a little bit of parallel there.
Yeah.
But yeah, it seems to come out of left field, doesn't it?
But it seems very Zen to me.
Oh yeah.
We're all one.
Yeah.
To Mark Halliday's point, there are, and Jonathan pointed this out to me, there are parodies. 13 Ways of Looking at a Tortilla, 13 Ways of Looking at a Cockroach. Those are two that are easily Googled.
Well, the most prominent one, Amir Baraka's 13 Ways of Looking at a Black Man, where he takes this and then he again, it's who gets the right to view objective reality. He turns it on its head about race.
Yeah.
That I would take more seriously.
Yeah. As I said before, the fifth stanza is really one of my favorite things in the poem, the inflections and innuendos, and the beauty of inflections and the beauty of innuendos. And I guess I think that I'm more used to thinking about beautiful inflections than about beautiful innuendos, and that I don't automatically think of innuendos as beautiful. I usually think of them as kind of nasty. Um, but I think that's I think that's one of the more fascinating. Stephen? Oh.
He
And
read,
then-
he read that the verse 5. He went, or just after. He took it was a dead stop between the or and the just.
Oh, you're right. Yeah.
That's what he read.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which suggests the innuendo.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Um, uh, that, yeah, that, that's, to me, that's such that whole stanza is so much about art, and what can happen in a poem or a painting or a piece of music. Um, uh, are you are you are you in it? Are you in the middle of it? Or are you already thinking about what has just happened, what has just occurred, or what is about to occur? Um, you're in such a you're in a kind of fascinating time zone in uh hmm, in that place. Your before and during and after, and I think that's I think the whole poem is in that ambiguous in that ambiguous place in time, um, that I find both fascinating and mysterious. Um, um,
I was thinking that the numbers leave us in that just after. There's lots of just after in the poem that
yeah,
I think is
like 13.
yes, exactly.
13 just afters.
Yeah, I love that stanza too, and I think the just after matters here.
Yeah.
Stevens, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And then I mean, this is it seems to me a very interesting transition from that. It's both beautiful, but it's also intellectual. There's an idea. There are ideas in that, and then um, suddenly you're getting much more of a kind of image stanza with the icicles. The icicles filled the long window with barbaric glass, and barbaric is kind of is one of those words that you're not expecting, that kind of comes out of nowhere, at least in this poem. That's a kind of shock, um, to me. I guess I guess what I'm thinking now has to do with the way we started our conversation, listening to Wallace Stevens, and at least some of our resistance to the way he reads, that the there's a kind of multiplicity of experience in this poem, and that uh, and I think six is one of the more surprising experiences in the context of the poem. The shadow of the blackbird crossed it to and fro. The mood traced in the shadow an indecipherable cause. Indecipherable cause. It's very intellectual. After this very vivid image. It would be interesting to see if they exist. I don't know. It would be interesting to see drafts of this poem and to see if everything was actually originally in the order that they are in now, or did some stanzas get stuck in later, or the sequence is seems to me an issue in this poem, and I buy it. I buy the sequence that it's in. I don't think, I think stanza 6 should really be section 6 should be section 8, or section 9 should be stanza 5. I totally accept it. But I'm. It does make me curious whether how much he worked on the order of this poem.
Lloyd,
Yes.
can I just
Yes,
notice something this time about the order of the poem? In the first stanza, that word moving, which I'm quite fond of, as much as I am of I, because until you get to the third line, I almost feel like that's moving emotionally, you know? Among 20 snowy mountains, the only moving thing was missing you, or whatever it is, you know,
Yeah.
moving in that sense.
No,
and I do think that if I were to try to find for myself an emotional through line for this poem that's carried in the intellectual play, it has to do with different kinds of contradictions of moving and being moved. And why does the mind want to move? What is it looking for when we're looking? Are we just looking? Are we looking for something that's not there? And is that flat fact? Or is it the nothing that is not there? You know? So when we get to the end,
or the nothing that is.
Exactly. So when we get to the second, thank you. When we get to section 11, the river is moving, the blackbird must be flying. You know, moving comes back there, but I don't think for a second that it means
Emotionally, yeah.
what I thought it meant for a second in the first stanza.
In the first stanza.
Although isn't that a funny thing to say? Why even bother to say the river is moving, you know, because it's not frozen? Even that, by that time in the poem, I'm starting to think, but that's I think what I feel in this kind of snowy moving poem. I mean, even back in the first one, I think, well, 20 mountains is too many to count. Who's looking at the picture and trying to count them? And if you are counting them, you couldn't possibly see the eye of a bird moving, although your eye is moving. You know, and does that mean, you know, a ... that I'm moved around in it? Why am I moved around? I'm trying to find my place, or I'm trying to find X, whatever it is, or whatever it was. So anyway, my train of thought on that was following what was moving at the beginning to what's moving at the end. And in the very last stanza, time isn't even moving, you know? It was evening all afternoon. Even as that seems like a puzzle, it seems so true of winter when the sky's already this plain dull white all afternoon, it doesn't change. Even as it's snowing, so that should be changing. How can we be in both of those places? So I guess that's a sort of an intellectualized answer to what I find moving emotionally, visually, in conceptually in the poem.
Yeah.
Boy, can I say something about order? It also related to what Jennifer was just saying about motion. As a mental exercise, I tried reading this in reverse order.
Ooh.
13 to 1.
Uh-huh.
And it was surprisingly satisfying. And I was not sure that it made it a significantly different poem. And a lot of it had to do with how movement is handled particularly at the beginning and particularly at the end and in between, so that if you would want to call it the emotional movement in reverse order, in response to the physical correlate, was similar.
Yeah.
To me.
I think section 1 would be a fabulous ending.
Yeah, it felt fine as the ending.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that was just a little mental exercise to kind of pull it apart and see how it was operating.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's just fascinating.
It was fun to do. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Bill.
With respect to movement, I just realized that the poet is stationary really through the whole thing except in 11.
Right.
And Stevens refers to himself as he, typically. That's his I.
Yeah.
And so that's the one point at which the person moves. For the rest, the person seems to be stationary while things whirl or stab around him.
Yeah. John?
It feels to me like one thing that the order of the poem does is it separates stanzas where it feels like he's very self-consciously trying to create a different voice. You know, like the "O Thin Man of Haddam."
Right.
You know, you wouldn't want that to be at the beginning of the poem. And it has a very different character from, you know, the among 20 mountains, and that
Right.
has a very kind of quiet and sweeping feeling to it. And the he rode over Connecticut in the glass coach to me, it feels like a different voice coming in there. And so it does separate those kind of, to the extent that the stanzas have different characters. He's not bunching any of the ones that are similar. They're kind of, has a kind of an assorted quality to it for me.
Oh yeah. I think that's very very central in the poem and an important part of the poem and part of those the different ways.
Right.
Yeah, I think I want to go back to what Jennifer was saying a couple of minutes ago about the word moving in the first stanza, and I share that experience, but I also think that it's also, just as an image, it's a really wonderful image of this complete stillness, this complete quietude, where nothing is moving except, is physically moving, except this little tiny thing, the eye of the blackbird, and yet it's so still that the movement, this movement of this little tiny eye is actually perceptible even from a distance in which you can see 20 mountains. Bill, you look like you said something, but I couldn't hear you. No. Jim.
I want to get to the next one if possible.
Okay.
The question is, what blackbird are we talking about? I don't know that it matters, but to me, blackbirds walking around the feet of women is, to me, evokes crows, not red-winged blackbirds. And I don't know that we know what blackbird we are necessarily talking about.
Right.
In fact, I think that could be true.
So this is not a red-winged blackbird. There is I looked up blackbird because I wanted to make sure that I knew what it looked like.
Yeah.
And it has quite a extensive history and popularity. Sounded to me as if it appears more often in Europe than here.
Right, but that's not our blackbird.
And one physical thing that was interesting is that it said there is around the eye, there is a yellow ring.
Yeah.
So now every time I read about the eye, I put in this yellow ring.
But I don't think this is the European blackbird, and therefore, I mean, my image throughout this poem was that this is not a blackbird, that these are crows. And
why would you do that? Why would you change it to a crow?
That's the bird, the black bird that I evoke, especially in winter when I walk my neighborhood. What blackbird do I see? Crows, and they are there throughout, and they whirl, and they sit still, and they whistle in their way, but not really.
No, they don't.
But I don't know. Well, anyway, that's just about the image I have of a red-winged blackbird, which is our native blackbird and the native blackbird in Connecticut.
Well,
crows have their own connotations. They're often written about, and they have a completely different set of attributes.
I agree, and those are the words I am assigning to this.
Okay, all right.
Well, I actually had an interesting conversation with Jim Haber and Susan yesterday, and I was mentioning one of my favorite songs, "Bye Bye Blackbird."
Blackbird singing in the dead of
And Jim found an image online of the original sheet music. And the original sheet music shows a red-winged blackbird. And I had never thought of the blackbird in that song as a red-winged blackbird. And I thought of the image in that song as a crow or a raven, as something completely black. And yet in the sheet music, there is that red, that explosion of red on the wing of the bird.
Well, that's interesting. Another thing about the blackbird, not the red-winged blackbird, not crows, is that it is noted for its, this is a quote, rich melodic song. And you do not connect that with crows. Or the
right.
other birds mentioned. So,
Right. Well, and then whistling. I mean, I don't think of crows whistling, and that's what's described.
I actually Googled the sound of the blackbird, and I recommend you're doing that. It's very interesting.
The red wing?
No, blackbird. The blackbird. It is a particular, I don't know what.
Is it a whistle?
At the end, there is a kind of whistling sound, but it is also, it's distinct. It's also known as one of the birds that you can hear best at dawn. It's worth looking up what the actual characteristics of this bird.
Okay.
I'll stop.
All right. O thin men of Haddam. Uh, uh, that's a complete change of tone. And I mean, to me, that's it sounds both biblical and satiric. Golden birds. I think of Yeats, but Yeats is later. I mean, the famous golden bird in Yeats is 10 years later than this poem. Why do you imagine golden birds? Catherine?
Are golden birds phoenixes?
Guess they could be.
I mean, I think that's the only image of a gold bird, gold as opposed to yellow.
Great singer.
Susan? I didn't hear what you said.
Who, me?
You. You.
We're looking at the Eurasian blackbird, which has the golden ring around its eye, and it can really sing like nobody's business.
But doesn't live here.
But
Right.
that's poetry.
It can live in the poem.
Yeah,
Exactly.
I thought, I did not assume that Stevens was talking about a literal black. I just assumed that he was making his own blackbird that might be different from what we have around here.
There's also the whole kind of Arabian Nights thing of a manufactured bird, a bird made of gold, which is, all about imagination and opulence.
Right.
And this suburb, Haddam, is very wealthy. The Gillette Castle, and so I think it's a comment about the distraction of capitalism, distraction of wealth.
Yeah, I took the golden bird like the golden idol in the Bible. I thought this is valuing the invented value of currency of gold versus the actual value of life. The birds around the feet of women.
Yeah. But it's fascinating that here at the sort of I guess really the halfway point in the poem, the tone completely changes, and then it changes to something else. I know noble accents, which sound like inflections to me. I know noble accents and lucid, inescapable rhythms. But I know too that the blackbird is involved in what I know. And I that's a stanza that I think maybe ends better than it begins, or that convinces me by the end of the stanza, although I'm not sure where I am at the beginning of the stanza.
It's like the first verse in that noble is also an anagram of no, not quite, but it looks like it. Sounds like noble, no.
I know noble accents, lucid, inescapable rhythms.
Or rhymes, right?
He said rhyme.
He said rhymes. Yeah, but my book says rhythms.
Yeah.
So I think there's a relation that you guys have made me see between 7 and 8. Because I think in 7, he's giving voice to exasperation, which he does a lot in the early poetry. He's exasperated with people who seem to try to deny or downplay the element of imagination in our,
Right.
in our
Beauty.
lives.
Yeah.
So that's there in 7. And then in 8, he turns it on himself. And it's a correction to his own ego, I think, because, he thinks of himself as a person with a mind full of Keats and Shelley and Wordsworth. But there is always something escaping his understanding. And he's reminding himself of that. In other words, he's not as different from the thin men of Haddam as he might have thought a minute ago.
Oh, great. Good. No, I think that's very helpful. That's very helpful about these odd stanzas. I know too that the Blackbird is involved in what I know. And there is that mysterious imagination, or it's not a nightingale, but it might as well be.
Well, it's something that escapes him. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
right. Just as the nightingale ultimately escapes from Keats.
Yeah.
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 And
And then it flies out of sight in the very next stanza.
right.
I have a question about the word "but" in stanza 8.
Oh, okay.
I cannot figure out whether the "but" is putting the noble accents and lucid inescapable rhythms in opposition to the Blackbird, as whether it's saying there are two completely different ways of knowing, or whether they are actually, it is all one way of knowing, and the Blackbird is incorporated into it. And from the syntax, I maybe somebody can help me out. Is there some implication that the noble accents and lucid inescapable rhythms are not adequate? Well, in other words, what is that "but" doing?
I'll take a stab at it if no one else will.
I mean, I hear it as, but I also have to admit that the Blackbird is involved. In other words, the unknowable is actually always there within what I feel I know.
So they're not in opposition, they're all more or less, the way of knowing includes everything in that stanza. I think that's what you're saying.
Yeah. Well, that there's something about knowing, knowledge, ability, capacity, talent, but that there's also but in addition to that, there is also something unknowable, some kind of inspiration, some kind of something that triggers what you know, that isn't entirely explainable, that's mysterious in some way.
Well, the "but" is a pretty powerful word. I mean, you could leave it out and you would still have a coherent stanza,
right?
But it would not mean the same thing.
I know, yeah.
So
I think that the "but" is centrally important, right? That the first two lines are this elegant, intellectual way of understanding, noble, lucid, inescapable rhythm. But I know the Blackbird is involved. Seems to me more elemental, animal, basic kind of way of appreciating that is left out in those other ways.
The but gives the speaker some particular characterization. I can't figure out what the word is, but the speaker has a particular relationship to that second kind of knowing, which the but brings out.
Yeah. Yeah.
Lloyd, I was going to add that when I read section 8, I was remembering another Stevens poem that's called Not the Idea of the Thing, but the Thing Itself. You know, and like Williams saying, no truth but in things. And I think this is Stevens fighting because he does not know maybe where he stands in that. So you would think a poem called No Idea but the Things, but the Thing Itself would just be things. And it's not. It's another poem like this with both images and then analysis of images. So I think the but is Stevens' mind maybe saying, no, it's not just that. I'm not going to be an imagist. I'm not just going to be like the Chinese poets, but I'm not going to be the intellectual poet captured by the mind. I'm going to try to see if I can fluctuate and have my mind sit in both camps at the same time.
Right. And then you're saying there's a sense of tension between the two. He's kind of fighting. I think that feels right. Yeah. That feels right.
Yeah. When the Blackbird flew out of sight, it marked the edge of one of many circles. No, I think we're, in some way that brings me back to the beginning of the poem. We're kind of, the trajectory of the poem has really changed a lot in the previous two stanzas. And then maybe in stanza 9, we're almost back to the snowy mountains and the only moving thing.
He's also explicitly describing a tangent.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
The stanza is in its way a tangent.
Of marking the edge of the circle. Yeah. Yeah.
Or of many circles.
Of many circles, yeah. At the site of sorry?
And it happens just after he says, the Blackbird is involved in what I know. And the Blackbird flies out of sight. So that I found it, again, a very powerful image of him trying to grapple with this imaginative relationship to nature, to the imagination of the real world, and it escapes.
Right. But like, thinking back a few minutes to the idea of the nightingale in Keats's Ode to a Nightingale, just flying away. At the sight of blackbirds flying in a green light, I'm now in a completely different world. I think of German expressionism, just some kind of glaring shocking color that hasn't fit into the picture, hasn't fit into what we've been looking at before at all. The bawds, even the bawds of euphony would cry out sharply. So who are these bawds of euphony? They have to be. It sounds like poets that Stevens doesn't like very much.
Poets.
I'm sorry?
Poets of the pretty.
Yes, poets of the pretty.
Bards, right? It's
Yeah.
people who go all to the pretty.
But he's calling them whores.
No.
Yes. Yes. And I think they're poets we don't read anymore. So that'll teach them. He rode over Connecticut in a glass coach. Once a fear pierced him. In that he mistook the shadow of his equipage for blackbirds. Kind of like a fairy tale. There, and a startling confession in the third person that he's afraid of something.
I'll reiterate that ravens and crows are more ominous than blackbirds.
Go ahead, Susan.
It picks up for me the barbaric icicles and piercing, and that there is some terror that he has failed in his attempt to be a poet or to transform or to be an artist, and that he mistook his own shadow for what was the true shadow of a creative gesture.
Yeah. No, I think that's I think that's right.
You wonder whether he's saying blackbirds and thinking crows. To take Jim's point, blackbirds scan better than crow would, and you've got Sing a Song of Sixpence, 4 and 20 blackbirds baked into a pie. He cannot not have been thinking of that rhyme.
May I say that I heard a whole tree of blackbirds in Ohio and in Connecticut singing and warbling the sweetest sounds. And for me, that the emotion of the beauty of inflections, the beauty of innuendos, the blackbird whistling, or just after, is some emotive connection we don't expect from Wallace Stevens to reveal, and that therefore crows for me take away the possibility of the beauty of that song and what Lloyd was saying about music and art, which allows us that gorgeous play of mind back and forth in time.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No. No.
You found something interesting and you have to force her to say it.
All right, Susan.
Which is a poem by Heine called Mein Wagen rollet langsam. I don't know if anybody knows this, but it's about a carriage rolling through the countryside, and 3 ghosts or images appear and mock the speaker. I can't read it in Yeah, I could read it in English, but anyway, it's very similar. You know what I'm talking about, Lloyd?
I don't know the poem, no.
The great song. It's set by Schumann, and it was one of Craig's favorite songs, Craig Smith's favorite songs.
Wow.
And the poem is really haunting and scary, where these ghostly things appear next to it out his carriage window.
Oh, I have to listen to that. Yeah.
Okay, I can
I
send you.
will. Maybe I know it, but I've forgotten it.
I don't have it here, but it's in German. Yeah, I guess there is. Yes, I do want to hear the English translation. Look. Never mind.
Okay.
Like a lead balloon, isn't it? I don't know. Both of those apparitions in the icicle poem, the icicle canto, and this one are a shadow of real foreboding, maybe death, which is the province of blackbirds.
Yeah. Yeah. I think I think that's right. I think that's inescapable. Stands section 12. The river is moving. The blackbird must be flying. It's somehow both. Well, it's the shortest stanza in the. No, it's it's shorter than stanza 3. But it's only 2 lines. It's the shortest stanza in the poem. It's in some way the simplest stanza in the poem. And in some way, it's incredibly mysterious.
Well, Lloyd.
Yeah.
Earlier, there was mention of the fact that in Chinese poetry, there is simply the reference to the image.
Yes.
But in Chinese poetry, as I understand it, the image is redolent of meaning. And for example, when a river is moving, it's the passage of time, historical time, and speaks of that flow from the past to the present to the future in a fatalistic way, just as when flowers or mountains or any landscape is mentioned or a blossom, it has a very particular nuance of meaning, an innuendo, if you like, or something even more specific. So that there is, I wonder if Wallace Stevens was acquainted with that, whether he might be alluding to that sort of, that culture.
Well, definitely, because remember, Pound is written about imagism. He's got his little treatise about the Chinese character and meaning, and then those poems were becoming very popular at the time, and I'm sure he would be aware of them too. Although the Buddhist nature of it, from the Tang poems, were still saying the ultimate reality of the thing is what counted, not not the court meaning that you overlay on it. That was the experience of the thing itself in the world. And that's why I said we have a hard time with that. I don't think we can sit in that world. Even Williams, who said no truth but in things, then after a short time begins to give you talk to go with the things too. So I think there's a push-pull about that.
So I think we have to end our discussion, and maybe it's just right to end it before we get to the very last stanza of the poem. And thank Marita Coombs and the Somerville Library for the time and the space. Yes. And thank you all for coming and participating. We'll have something next month. Not sure when, not sure what, but you will find out. And thank you so much. I once again, I've learned so much from something that I thought I knew really well, but was still puzzled by. So thank you, Marita.
Thank you, and thank you, Lloyd, and thank you, everybody. This was lovely.